The fundamental definition of imperial conquest has undergone a terrifying, highly sanitized evolution over the last 75 years. When the modern citizen imagines the subjugation of a sovereign nation, their mind immediately conjures the visceral, archaic imagery of kinetic warfare. They picture columns of mechanized infantry crossing borders, the devastating aerial bombardment of industrial centers, and the violent physical occupation of foreign capitals by standing armies. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the architects of global empire realized that traditional kinetic warfare is a brutally inefficient, politically volatile, and astronomically expensive mechanism for wealth extraction. Dropping unguided munitions on a copper mine or a deep-water port destroys the exact physical infrastructure that the invading empire wishes to exploit. The modern financial syndicate required a cleaner, infinitely more efficient, and completely invisible method of colonization. They abandoned the blunt instrument of the military-industrial complex and embraced the ultimate weapon of mass subjugation, the sovereign debt trap. To understand how entire nations are quietly, systematically conquered without a single shot being fired, you must examine the architecture of the post-World War II financial order. In 1944, as the physical empires of Europe were reduced to smoldering ash, the victorious financial powers gathered at Bretton Woods to construct a new, centralized global apparatus. Out of this conference emerged twin leviathans, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These institutions were presented to the global public under a masterful, heavily propagandized banner of benevolence. They were officially chartered to eradicate global poverty, stabilize fractured currencies, and provide the critical financial scaffolding necessary to rebuild the developing world. In reality, they were the heavily weaponized enforcement arms of the fiat dollar hegemony, designed specifically to transition the world from an era of overt military colonialism into an era of covert financial neocolonialism. The protocol of the sovereign debt trap is executed with cold, algorithmic precision. It begins with the identification of a target. The global financial institutions specifically seek out developing nations that possess immense, untapped reserves of physical, tangible wealth, vast subterranean deposits of crude oil, rare earth minerals, lithium, copper, or highly strategic geopolitical coastlines. However, these nations critically lack the domestic capital, the heavy industrial machinery, and the technological infrastructure required to extract and refine those physical resources. Furthermore, the target nation is frequently governed by a corrupt, easily compromised, or economically illiterate political elite, desperate for short-term prestige and rapid influxes of cash to secure their own domestic power. Once the target is acquired, the financial syndicate dispatches highly credentialed economic emissaries. These individuals do not arrive wearing military uniforms. They arrive wearing bespoke suits, carrying briefcases overflowing with complex macroeconomic projections and thousands of pages of legally binding international contracts. They sit down with the leaders of the developing nation and present a deeply intoxicating, irresistible financial hallucination. They offer a massive, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure loan. The pitch is always framed around national salvation and modernization. The global institution promises to fund the construction of sprawling hydroelectric dams, deep-water shipping ports, massive four-lane highway systems, and state-of-the-art power grids. The emissaries present highly manipulated, overly optimistic econometric models that mathematically guarantee this new infrastructure will trigger explosive, double-digit gross domestic product growth. They assure the local politicians that the massive surge in national revenue will easily, effortlessly cover the interest payments on the multi-billion-dollar loan. Blinded by the promise of immediate political legacy and the inevitable, quiet siphoning of funds into their own offshore bank accounts, the leaders of the target nation sign the sovereign debt agreement. The trap is officially set, but the lethal architecture of the debt trap is hidden within the fine print of the currency denomination. The global institutions do not lend the developing nation money in their own local currency. The loans are strictly, uncompromisingly denominated in United States dollars or occasionally euros. This single structural mandate instantly transfers 100% of the macroeconomic risk directly onto the shoulders of the impoverished nation. The developing country cannot print United States dollars. To service the debt, they must physically extract their natural resources, sell them on the open global market, and convert the proceeds into the fiat currency of the empire. Furthermore, the billions of dollars allocated for the infrastructure loan rarely, if ever, actually touch the domestic economy of the target nation. The funds do not flow into the local banking system to hire local engineers, purchase local concrete, or empower the domestic working class. Instead, the loan agreements contain strict stipulations requiring the developing nation to hire massive, heavily connected Western engineering and construction conglomerates. The newly printed fiat dollars are transferred from the global institution directly into the corporate accounts of these massive foreign syndicates. The Western corporations swoop in, build the deep water port or the hydroelectric dam, and immediately extract the capital back to the financial centers of London and New York. The physical infrastructure remains in the developing nation, but the multi-billion-dollar liability is permanently shackled to the sovereign balance sheet of the target country. The mathematical doom loop is meticulously designed to snap shut the moment the global macroeconomic weather changes. The developing nation is entirely at the mercy of forces it cannot control. When the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. decides to aggressively raise interest rates to combat domestic inflation, the value of the U.S. dollar violently spikes on the global foreign exchange markets. Simultaneously, as the global economy cools, the prices of the physical commodities, the oil, the copper, the agricultural exports that the developing nation relies upon, plummet. This creates a catastrophic, inescapable financial singularity. The developing nation suddenly finds that its own local currency has been completely decimated against the mighty, artificially strengthened US dollar. They must now print exponentially more of their own currency, simply to acquire the exact same amount of dollars required to make the monthly interest payment. The massive infrastructure projects, the dams and the highways, fail to deliver the wildly exaggerated, mathematically fraudulent GDP growth promised by the initial econometric models. The nation is trapped in a classic, fatal short squeeze. They are generating less revenue, their currency is collapsing, and the cost of servicing their dollar-denominated debt has mathematically doubled or tripled overnight. The political elite of the target nation suddenly realize that the national treasury is entirely functionally empty. They cannot pay the interest, let alone the principal, on the multi-billion-dollar sovereign loan. They are staring directly into the abyss of a catastrophic, humiliating sovereign default that will instantly lock them out of the global financial system, freezing their supply chains and triggering immediate violent domestic riots. Desperate, terrified, and out of options, the leaders of the developing nation are forced to pick up the phone and call the exact same global institutions that engineered the crisis in the first place. They beg for emergency relief, for a debt restructuring, for a financial lifeline to save their government from total collapse. The emissaries in the bespoke suits return to the capital city, but this time they do not bring promises of modernization and explosive growth. They bring the ultimate, uncompromising terms of surrender. They inform the developing nation that the global institution will graciously provide a new emergency bailout loan to prevent a sovereign default. However, this new capital is entirely conditional. It requires the target nation to sign a legally binding treaty known as a structural adjustment program. This document is the modern financial equivalent of a treaty of unconditional military surrender. It effectively legally transfers the sovereign authority of the nation directly to the central banking syndicate. The global institutions dictate that in order to receive the bailout, the nation must immediately, violently slash its domestic budget. The government is ordered to gut funding for public hospitals, shut down rural schools, eliminate life-sustaining food and energy subsidies for the working class, and freeze the pensions of the elderly. The domestic population, entirely innocent of the geopolitical financial engineering that trapped their nation, is forcefully plunged into a state of grinding, agonizing austerity. They are subjected to the ruthless, mathematical extraction of their life energy, simply to ensure that the massive Western banking syndicates do not have to register a loss on their proprietary ledgers. The conquest is executed flawlessly, silently, and legally, without a single bomb ever leaving the bomb bay. The implementation of a structural adjustment program is not merely an economic policy shift. It is the systematic, legalized, and algorithmic looting of a sovereign nation's physical infrastructure. When the target nation is mathematically forced to its knees, completely unable to service the explosive dollar-denominated interest payments, the global financial institutions demand the absolute privatization of state-owned enterprises. These are the crown jewels of the nation: the municipal water treatment facilities, the national energy grids, the telecommunications networks, and the vast strategic transportation hubs. The deeply compromised government is ordered to auction off these critical, life-sustaining hard assets to the highest bidder under the heavily weaponized guise of market efficiency and fiscal responsibility. But the domestic population, entirely crushed by the engineered inflation and the brutal austerity measures mandated by the bailout, possesses absolutely zero capital to participate in this auction. The only entities mathematically capable of purchasing these assets are the massive multinational corporations headquartered in the exact same Western financial capitals that engineered the debt trap in the first place. They swoop in and purchase the foundational infrastructure of a foreign nation for absolute pennies on the dollar. A multi-billion-dollar hydroelectric dam, built with the blood, sweat, and tax revenue of the local workforce, is suddenly handed over to a foreign syndicate for a microscopic fraction of its true intrinsic value. Once the foreign corporation takes physical ownership of the water supply or the energy grid, the consequences for the working class are immediate and violently destructive. The foreign owners instantly raise the rates on the impoverished citizens. Basic human survival, access to clean, potable drinking water or the electricity required to heat a home, is suddenly commodified and priced at a massive premium to ensure maximum quarterly shareholder returns in London or New York. The profits generated by these newly privatized utilities do not stay within the developing nation to build domestic schools, hospitals, or roads. They are systematically extracted, converted back into fiat dollars, and funneled completely out of the country, completely decapitalizing the domestic economy and leaving the citizens as permanent, subjugated rent payers in their own land. The second pillar of the structural adjustment surrender is the forced, unconditional removal of all capital controls and protective tariffs. The global institutions demand absolute free trade. They force the developing nation to open its borders to heavily subsidized, industrially produced agricultural products from the West. The local farmers, who have cultivated the land for generations and form the absolute backbone of the domestic economy, are instantly bankrupted. They are completely, mathematically unable to compete with massive, taxpayer-funded multinational agribusinesses that can dump cheap, processed grain into the local markets. The nation violently loses its food sovereignty. It transitions from a self-sustaining agricultural producer into a helpless, dependent consumer, forced to import its basic caloric needs using a fiat currency it does not control and must borrow to obtain. The absolute apex of the debt trap conquest is the seizure of the subterranean wealth. The global institutions force the developing nation to entirely rewrite its domestic mining, drilling, and environmental laws. The sovereign state is systematically stripped of its legislative ability to heavily tax or regulate the foreign extraction syndicates. Massive, sprawling open-pit copper mines and deep-water offshore oil rigs are established by foreign corporations. They ruthlessly rip the physical, finite wealth out of the earth, leaving behind highly toxic ecological devastation, poisoned water tables, and fractured local communities, while paying a mathematically insulting microscopic royalty rate to the corrupt local government. The true wealth of the nation, the physical assets that could have funded centuries of genuine, organic prosperity, are permanently transferred to the balance sheets of the global elite. When a nation attempts to resist this extraction, or when the political elite finally realize the mathematical impossibility of the debt and attempt to declare a formal sovereign default, the financial syndicate unleashes its most terrifying, specialized weapon, the vulture fund. These are hyper-aggressive, incredibly well-funded hedge funds operating out of the shadows of the Western financial system. They wait until the target nation defaults, the price of its sovereign bonds collapses to absolute zero. The vulture funds then purchase this distressed, unpayable debt for literal pennies on the dollar. They do not negotiate. They do not restructure the debt. They immediately deploy armies of elite, highly paid corporate lawyers to aggressively sue the sovereign nation in the international courts of New York or London. Because the original debt contracts were written by the financial syndicate, the developing nation has legally waived its sovereign immunity. The vulture funds obtain international court orders to aggressively, physically seize whatever sovereign assets the target country possesses outside its own borders. They legally hijack national airline jets sitting on foreign runways. They seize massive, state-owned commercial shipping vessels, fully loaded with export cargo docked in international ports. They freeze the foreign bank accounts of the sovereign central bank. The nation is completely violently blockaded from participating in global commerce until it capitulates and pays the vulture fund the absolute, full face value of the original debt, plus decades of compounded, extortionate interest. It is the ultimate, absolute weaponization of the legal system to enforce the financial colonization of a nation. The Western financial institutions perfected this algorithmic conquest throughout the late 20th century, completely subjugating the continents of South America and Africa, draining them of their physical vitality to prop up the fiat illusions of the West. But in the 21st century, a new, highly aggressive apex predator has adopted and ruthlessly modernized the exact same playbook. Recognizing the absolute, undeniable brilliance of the debt trap protocol, the People's Republic of China launched the Belt and Road Initiative. This is heavily propagandized as a benevolent global infrastructure project, but the mathematical reality dictates that it is the largest, most aggressive geopolitical financial enclosure in human history. The Chinese Communist Party targets the exact same vulnerable, resource-rich, politically unstable nations that the IMF and the World Bank exploited, but the Chinese terms are infinitely more opaque, significantly more aggressive, and structurally designed to bypass the traditional Western banking syndicate entirely. They offer massive, multi-billion-dollar loans to construct highly strategic deep-water ports, sprawling freight railways, and advanced 5G telecommunication networks across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The loans are entirely hidden behind strict, impenetrable non-disclosure agreements that legally prevent the target nation from ever revealing the true catastrophic terms of the debt to their own citizens or the international community. The absolute lethal innovation of the Chinese debt trap is the direct, unashamed collateralization of physical sovereignty. Unlike the Western institutions that demand structural adjustments and ideological austerity, the Chinese state-owned banks demand physical, strategic, hard assets as the explicit collateral for the loan. They specifically target critical geopolitical choke points and maritime shipping routes. If the target nation fails to make the impossible, dollar-denominated interest payments, the Chinese government does not merely demand the privatization of the water supply, they legally, forcefully seize the physical asset itself. The textbook execution of this modern, aggressive conquest occurred on the highly strategic island nation of Sri Lanka. The Chinese government loaned billions of dollars to a deeply corrupt, highly ambitious Sri Lankan political dynasty to build a massive, economically unviable deepwater port in the southern town of Hambantota. The economic projections presented to justify the loan were completely fabricated. The port generated virtually zero revenue, completely failing to attract global commercial shipping traffic. When the Sri Lankan government inevitably defaulted on the astronomical unpayable debt, the Chinese state did not hesitate to execute the contract. They activated the collateral clause. In 2017, the sovereign government of Sri Lanka was mathematically forced to formally hand over the entire physical port, along with thousands of acres of surrounding sovereign land, directly to a Chinese state-owned enterprise on a legally binding 99-year lease. The Chinese military and commercial apparatus now possesses a highly strategic, deepwater naval outpost sitting directly atop one of the most critical, heavily trafficked maritime shipping lanes on the entire planet. They did not have to deploy a single aircraft carrier to the Indian Ocean. They did not have to fire a single ballistic missile. They did not have to sacrifice a single soldier to conquer this highly strategic territory. They conquered it entirely with a spreadsheet, a corrupt politician, and a mathematically unpayable infrastructure loan. The debt trap protocol is the ultimate perfected weapon of the modern empire, ensuring that the physical geography of the planet is entirely silently consolidated into the hands of the central creditors, leaving the citizens as permanent, subjugated tenants on the land their ancestors once proudly owned. If you are recognizing the absolute mathematical reality of this global financial architecture, you must act now. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it to break the algorithmic suppression of the corporate media. Go to the comments section right now and state your country and your exact viewing time. We must document the global awakening to this system. The illusion of first world immunity is the most dangerous, highly cultivated psychological deception of the 21st century. The citizens of the industrialized West observe the economic subjugation of the developing world with a detached, deeply naive sense of insulated superiority. They view the sovereign debt traps of emerging markets, the brutal structural adjustments, and the algorithmic looting of national infrastructure as tragic but distant anomalies, the inevitable result of exotic corruption or primitive macroeconomic management. They believe that their advanced democracies, their sophisticated regulatory bodies, and their legacy fiat currencies completely shield them from this predatory financial architecture. This is a catastrophic miscalculation. The exact same apex predators, the exact same central banking syndicates that perfected the silent algorithmic colonization of the global south have completely, systematically turned their weapons inward. The debt trap protocol is no longer an export product reserved for foreign shores. It has been aggressively deployed domestically. You are not the beneficiary of the modern financial empire. You are the collateral. To recognize the domestic debt trap, you must confront the mathematical reality of your own sovereign balance sheet. The United States government, much like a deeply compromised political dynasty in a targeted developing nation, has completely abandoned organic, productive economic growth in favor of explosive, unsustainable, and highly toxic deficit spending. The multi-trillion-dollar national debt is not a benign accounting error or a manageable cyclical deficit. It is a weaponized intergenerational financial shackle. When the sovereign state borrows trillions of dollars to fund sprawling, endless overseas kinetic conflicts and massive, mathematically insolvent domestic entitlement programs, they are not generating wealth. They are issuing unpayable promissory notes to a centralized banking syndicate in the explicit legally. Binding collateral for those notes is the future taxation and the physical life energy of the domestic working class. The citizens of the Western world are currently living through the initial, suffocating phases of a brutal domestic structural adjustment program. It does not arrive with a formal treaty signed by foreign dignitaries in bespoke suits, and it is not announced in the evening news. It is executed silently, invisibly, through the stealth taxation of systemic fiat debasement. When the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank print trillions of unbacked currency units to artificially monetize the staggering sovereign debt, they are violently suppressing the purchasing power of your stored labor. The skyrocketing cost of physical housing, life-sustaining medical care, and basic agricultural calories is not a temporary supply chain glitch or the result of corporate greed. It is the engineered, mathematical extraction of your wealth required to service the unpayable liabilities of the state. You're being forced into a state of grinding, inescapable austerity, exactly like the citizens of a subjugated developing nation forced to pay the interest on an international monetary fund loan. The privatization of the crown jewels, the absolute hallmark of the global debt trap, is currently executing flawlessly across the American and European landscape. The massive, heavily capitalized private equity syndicates and Wall Street asset managers are playing the exact role of the foreign corporate invaders. Armed with infinite, nearly zero-interest credit lines provided directly by the central banking apparatus, these monolithic institutions are systematically devouring the foundational hard assets of the domestic economy. They are executing a ruthless, highly coordinated hostile takeover of the single-family housing market, outbidding working-class citizens with freshly printed fiat currency to convert sovereign home ownership into a permanent, highly lucrative, securitized rental class. The working citizen is aggressively transitioning into a subjugated tenant, forced to pay extortionate, hyperinflated rent to the very financial syndicate that engineered the inflation that priced them out of the market in the first place. This domestic enclosure extends far beyond residential real estate. The financial elite are aggressively acquiring domestic agricultural farmland, securing monopoly control over the physical food supply and the water tables. They are consolidating ownership of the critical logistical infrastructure, the medical facilities, and the domestic energy grids. The physical wealth of the nation, built over centuries by the grueling, productive labor of the middle class, is being rapidly, algorithmically transferred onto the centralized balance sheets of the financial aristocracy. The working class is being mathematically decapitalized, systematically stripped of their physical autonomy, and left entirely desperately dependent on the digital, depreciating fiat disbursements of the sovereign state. When a developing nation attempts to escape the international debt trap, the syndicate unleashes the vulture funds and the international courts to physically seize their assets. But when the domestic population inevitably begins to buckle under the sheer, unpayable weight of the inflation and the systemic inequality, the state prepares its own specialized mechanism of absolute totalitarian control. The domestic debt trap is currently being wired for its final, inescapable technological upgrade, the central bank digital currency, or CBDC. The legacy fractional reserve banking system, heavily reliant on the fragile illusion of commercial bank deposits and physical cash, is mathematically dying. To prevent a chaotic, violent bank run and a total collapse of the fiat illusion, the central banks intend to forcefully migrate the entire domestic population into a perfectly surveilled, flawlessly programmable digital panopticon. A CBDC is not a technological convenience designed for faster retail transactions. It is the ultimate, inescapable digital enclosure of the debt trap protocol. It fundamentally transforms your sovereign wealth from private property into a conditional, programmable liability of the central bank. If the government requires emergency capital to service the explosive parabolic interest on the national debt, they will no longer need to rely solely on the blunt instrument of systemic inflation. With a CBDC, they can execute surgical, targeted algorithmic wealth confiscation. They can instantly implement deeply negative interest rates directly on your digital wallet, silently deleting a percentage of your purchasing power every single month to force immediate consumption and liquidate the sovereign deficit. You cannot withdraw your capital to escape the penalty. You cannot hide your wealth in a physical safe. You're permanently locked inside the burning building of the fiat debt spiral. Furthermore, the programmable nature of the CBDC grants the state absolute, unchallengeable control over the velocity and the destination of your labor. The central bank can dictate exactly what goods and services you are legally permitted to purchase. They can enforce algorithmic carbon quotas, automatically freezing your digital transactions at the grocery store or the gas pump if you exceed your state-mandated energy allotment. They can sever your access to the digital economy instantly with a single automated keystroke if you express political dissent, participate in an unsanctioned protest, or attempt to resist the macroeconomic dictates of the financial elite. It is the absolute perfected synthesis of the sovereign debt trap and the authoritarian surveillance state, meticulously designed to permanently subjugate the domestic population and ensure the absolute supremacy of the central banking syndicate. The mathematical reality of this global and domestic architecture is completely unforgiving. The debt trap protocol is not a cyclical recession that can be fixed at the ballot box. It is a terminal, systemic end state. The massive $34 trillion sovereign liabilities will never be organically repaid through taxation or economic growth. The central banks will not willingly relinquish their power or voluntarily audit their own ledgers. The only mathematically viable response for the awakened citizen is to execute a total, uncompromising, and immediate financial secession from the fiat matrix. You must stop storing your life energy in the deeply compromised, rapidly depreciating debt instruments of the sovereign state. You must ruthlessly transition your capital out of the banking system and into unprintable, unseizable, absolute hard assets. Physical gold and physical silver are the ultimate, historically validated countermeasures against the domestic debt trap protocol. When you acquire physical bullion and take absolute sovereign custody of the metal outside of the traditional banking system, you are holding an asset entirely devoid of counterparty risk. It cannot be algorithmically diluted by a Federal Reserve mandate. It cannot be confiscated through a digital CBDC bail-in or a negative interest rate protocol. It is a dense, physical store of human energy that has successfully survived the collapse of every single fiat empire in recorded history. It is the ultimate indestructible shield against the stealth taxation of systemic inflation, perfectly preserving your purchasing power as the paper illusions violently burn to the ground. To achieve true global financial sovereignty in the 21st century, you must also utilize the ultimate cryptographically perfected weapon of the digital age, Bitcoin. Operating entirely outside the jurisdiction of any central bank, commercial syndicate, or sovereign state, Bitcoin is the absolute mathematical antidote to the debt trap. Its immutable supply cap of 21 million coins guarantees that it can never be inflated to fund a sovereign deficit or a proxy war. By converting your highly leveraged fiat currency into Bitcoin and strictly holding your own private cryptographic keys in cold storage, you're effectively shorting the entire global debt supercycle. You are securing your wealth on an unassailable, decentralized ledger that cannot be frozen, sanctioned, or algorithmically manipulated by the architects of the financial empire. The digital vault doors are closing, and the only capital that will survive the final stage of the debt trap protocol is the capital you secure in absolute, unyielding mathematical scarcity.